Civil War left the nation in a state of devastation. Rotting corpses filled the fields, the stench of decaying bodies filled the air, and desperation filled the hearts of those who had lost their loved ones. Towns had been gutted, plantations burned, fields neglected, bridges and railroads destroyed. Many white Southerners had been stripped of their slaves through emancipation and stripped of the capital that they had invested in now worthless Confederate bonds and currency. More than 258,000 Confederate soldiers had died in the war, and thousands more returned home sick or wounded. If the conditions were bad for whites, they were even worse for blacks. As soon as the war ended, hundreds of thousands of them, many of them ill and feeble, left the plantations in search of a new life of freedom. But most had nowhere to go, and few had any possessions other than the clothes on their back. For blacks and whites alike, Reconstruction became a struggle to find the meaning of freedom. The former slaves and the defeated whites had very different conceptions of what freedom meant, however. For African Americans, freedom meant above all an end to slavery, but it also meant acquiring rights and protections that would enable them to live as free people, just as whites did. As for white Southerners, freedom meant something very different. It meant the ability to control their own destinies without interference from the North or the federal government. Events in the South began to drive Northern opinion in even more radical directions. Throughout the South, in 1865 and early 1866, state legislatures were enacting sets of laws known as black codes. They were designed to give whites substantial control over former slaves, impose severe restrictions such as prohibiting their right to vote, forbidding them to sit on juries, limiting their right to testify against white men, carrying weapons in public places, and working in certain occupations. They even authorized local officials to apprehend unemployed blacks, fine them for vagrancy, and hire them out to private employers to satisfy the fine. Some of the codes forbade blacks to own or lease farms or take any jobs other than as plantation workers or domestic servants. Eventually, the Civil Rights Act was passed. This act declared that all persons born in the United States were now citizens without regard to race, color, or previous condition. As citizens, they can make and enforce contracts, sue and be sued, give evidence in court, and inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property. Persons who denied these rights to former slaves were guilty of a misdemeanor and upon conviction faced a fine not exceeding $1,000 or imprisonment not exceeding 1 year, or both. However, the activities of organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan undermined the workings of this act, and it failed to guarantee the civil rights of African Americans. In April of 1866, the 14th Amendment was proposed to Congress. It offered the first constitutional definition of American citizenship. Everyone born in the U.S. and everyone naturalized was automatically a citizen and entitled to all privileges and immunities guaranteed by the Constitution. It also imposed penalties, reduction of representation in Congress and in the Electoral College, on state that denied suffrage to any adult male inhabitants. However, even though the 14th Amendment gave blacks full citizenship, they still had yet to obtain full equality. Sooner than later, the new state constitution was drafted. A large percentage of the people involved were farmers and African Americans. African Americans were greatly important to this process because of the fact that they had denied a voice in the government for so long. Despite these great advancements, two new forms of farming were taking over the lives of many former slaves. The sharecropping and contract systems were basically legalized forms of slavery that kept its workers in a never-ending cycle of poverty. This was just one of the many setbacks for African Americans. Poll taxes, a newly established tax by the state government that forced African Americans to pay to vote, sabotaged the 15th Amendment, which gave former male slaves the right to vote. Because of these taxes and farming systems, former slaves could not afford to vote and were yet again denied a voice in the government. At this point, everything was progressing in the wrong direction. Even the government was in poor shape. Shortly after Ulysses S. Grant's election, his administration was already beginning to collapse amid scandal and economic depression. Grant had been foolishly appointing his friends from the army and his wife's relatives who were inexperienced and unqualified for government positions. He also took part in bribes and deviously handled federal funds. The nationwide panic spread in 1873, and banks completely ran out of business. People were beginning to lose interest in Reconstruction and blamed the county's problems on the Republicans, the majority in office at the time. In states where blacks were a majority, or where the populations of the two races were almost equal, whites used intimidation and violence to undermine the Reconstruction regimes. Secret societies such as the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of White Camellia, and others used terrorism to frighten or physically bar blacks from voting or otherwise exercising citizenship. The Ku Klux Klan alone killed more than 2,000 people by means of beatings, lynching, shootings, and the burning of houses. Paramilitary organizations such as the Red Shirts and White League armed themselves to police elections and force all white males to join the Democratic Party and to exclude all blacks from meaningful political activity. These terrorist groups struck fear in the eyes of many people, both blacks and whites alike. Jim Crow laws had also been constructed, which discriminated African Americans with concern to attendance in public schools and the use of facilities such as restaurants, theaters, hotels, cinemas, and public bathrooms. Trains and buses were also segregated, and in many states, marriages between whites and African American people were illegal. It became established that segregation was legal as long as facilities were kept separate but equal. Although this was never the case, African American people who disobeyed the state's transport segregation policies were arrested and fined. Overall, Reconstruction had been unsuccessful in more ways than one. It produced a legalized form of slavery, it led to scandal and economic depression, but most importantly, it failed in the ultimate goal of granting full equality to African Americans. A disappointment to many political leaders, Reconstruction was at the very least unsuccessful.
Like a startling sign that fate had finally found me, and your voice was all